Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews, and the full version of my out-of-the-box build of the 1/72nd scale Hasegawa Corsair. For this one, I'll be building Y883 of VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron that was led by the infamous Pappy Boyington. So, without further ado, let's have a build of this classic kit and see if it still holds up today. To start with, I gave all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the moulding process, and then I began to remove the kit's cockpit floor, seat, instrument panel, fuselage halves and joystick from the sprues using my side cutters. There are two very annoying antennas to be aware of that are moulded to the right fuselage and tail, which I would have to get fixed several times as they are very fragile and often came off when they got in the way. Any flash or remaining sprue was then filed off of these parts before the seat and joystick were glued to the inaccurate cockpit floor and the instrument panel was glued to the right fuselage. The two engine cylinder halves were then cut out, cleaned up and glued together, and then I cut out the lower wing parts, radiator and engine cowling. These parts needed a bit of cleaning with a file and a knife to remove seams and sprue joints, but once this was done, the radiators were then glued to the lower wings, and I cut out the upper wing halves, cleaned them up, and then glued them to the lower wings. Everything in this kit fitted together really well, and some bulldog clips were all that was needed to hold the wing halves together while the parts bonded. While the wing parts dried, I mixed up 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 4 drops of Vallejo gloss black primer and sprayed this in the fuselage halves, cockpit, engines and the cowling to prepare them for painting. The primer was given 12 hours to fully cure before I then sprayed the cockpit and fuselage walls with Vallejo Model Air 71010 interior green and the inside of the engine cowling with Model Air 71121 light gull grey. Both of these colours were thinned with Vallejo acrylic flow improver to a ratio of roughly 1 part flow improver to 1 part paint. The cylinders were then painted with some Vallejo Model Air metallic aluminium, and once these parts had had around about an hour to dry, I started picking out the details of the engine gearbox with some Vallejo Model Air ocean grey, the cockpit joystick and instrument panel with model colour flat black, and the engine's ignition wiring with some Vallejo model colour saddle brown. In a few areas, I'd applied the cockpit green a little bit too thin, so I used a brush to apply another thin coat, and then painted the ring around the gearbox of the engine with Vallejo model colour gold. No surface details are moulded to the sidewalls or main instrument panel, but decals are included to add a bit of detail, so I applied these onto the model, which was also a good chance to see if this second-hand kit's decals were usable, and fortunately it seemed they would be. Some Vallejo flat black was once again used, this time to paint details on the gearbox, and also the rear bulkhead the engine is moulded to, before I then glued the cockpit floor to the right fuselage. The fit of these parts was excellent, and once in place, the joystick button received some vermilion red, and then I joined the two fuselage halves together with Revell Contactor Professional, followed by the wings. To fill in the seam lines and add some additional strength to the kit, I then ran some Tamiya extra thin cement with its applicator along all of the seam lines between these parts. While those parts bonded, I cut out the horizontal stabilizers along with the main landing gear struts and tail wheel and landing gear doors, and once they were cut out, I carefully cleaned them up with a file to remove any sprue attachments and noticeable seams. For the main wheels, I also sanded one side of them a bit heavily to give a subtle weighted effect, causing a flatter side on the tyre. I then attached the horizontal stabilizers to the fuselage with Revell Contactor Professional, and once again ran some of the Tamiya extra thin over the joints. The engine and cowling were then attached to the front of the fuselage and fitted together perfectly with some very nice guide pins to help line everything up. The propeller required a fair bit of cleanup using a fine file to sand away the seam lines, but before adding it and the wheels to the aircraft, I first decided to rescore all of the kit's raised panel lines using a scribing tool and some SMS clear tape. I mainly used a Tamiya scribing tool for this, but for some of the harder spots I also used an AK Interactive scriber, and along the fuselage I also used my knife. I found that the kit's raised panel lines were too shallow and messy to be used as a guide alone, but the SMS clear tape meant I was able to get some really nice straight lines. I did however find that the tape loses its adhesiveness after only 3 or 4 panel lines, which was annoying, and it struggled a bit on the Corsair's curved fuselage. Next time I would also probably do the scribing of the kit before assembling it, just to make it a little bit easier. Once all the panel lines had been scribed, I then ran some Tamiya extra thin over all of the scored panels to soften them up a bit and make the effect more subtle. I probably also could have filled them in a tiny bit with some Vallejo water-based putty, but I was still pretty pleased with the results I'd achieved, and they were definitely a lot cleaner than my previous attempts at scoring panels. Generally, the Hasegawa kit seems to be pretty accurate, but it was missing the noticeable large access hatch on the forward fuselage, so I used an AK Interactive scribing guide to score it in using a needle after I'd matched it up with the size of the Tamiya kit's access hatch. The hatch was then made deeper using the AK Interactive scriber, and once again neatened up with some Tamiya extra thin. Strangely, the cowling in this kit has recessed panel lines, but they were very shallow, so I ended up going over them very lightly using the various scribing tools I had to make them a little bit more prominent. I'm still really trying to get the hang of scribing, but these are probably the best results I've achieved to date, and it was a lot of fun to practice on this smaller kit. There were however a few mistakes and seam lines that needed filling, so I used some Vallejo water-based putty applied rather liberally, and then once it had been applied, let it set for a few hours. If anyone notices I have a bandage on my finger, this was actually caused by a cat rather than anything related to modelling. Once it had dried, I then sanded away the excess putty using gradually finer sandpaper until I finished off with 2000 grit to make everything smooth. Some of the panel lines needed to be gently rescored with a knife, and once done, I gave the model a soak in some water to remove any debris from the putty and sanding. With the fuselage cleaned up, I then attached the tail wheel followed by the main landing gear struts, which are really nice and solid. Following this, I reattached the fuselage and tail antennas for the second time, added the kit's included exhaust pieces, and then started to add the landing gear bay doors. The entire landing gear is very solid and nicely detailed, and it goes together very easily. Unlike with most kits, there's nothing to attach the propeller to make it spin, though it fits tight enough to the engine that you don't really have to glue it into place. The main wheels were then glued onto the struts, and I placed the aircraft on a flat surface and lined up the sanded surface of the wheels so that they would sit flush on the ground. The tail wheel doors were the last parts to be added, and once in place, I covered over the cockpit and engine with some blue tack to mask them off, and I was ready to prime the model for painting. I once again used a mix of 1 part flow improver to 1 part gloss black primer, and sprayed the propeller and upper surface of the model, gradually building up the primer in several thin passes until the model's upper surface was a solid glossy black colour. I then let it dry to the touch, which only took a few minutes, and flipped the aircraft and propeller over to prime their undersides in the same fashion. For White 883, I decided to start painting the lighter undersides first with a mixture of about 5 parts acrylic flow improver, 2 drops of Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey, and 3 drops of Model Air Insignia White. The reason I mixed in the grey was to make the white a little bit darker to help stimulate shading, and also create a slightly darker base colour that would help with post shading. I was surprised to find that this mixture applied very easily and became solid after only a few light passes, even though it was a very light colour being applied onto black. I did experience some tip drying though, since I was using a lower pressure to help apply the paint in some finer spaces. Since I'd be painting this aircraft with some pretty heavy weathering, I decided to apply this mix onto the upper surface of the model to create some pre-shading. Recently I got a second airbrush needle as a spare, and I decided to swap this one out just in case any of the tip drying was caused by a slight bend in my older one. Before doing any of the post shading, I decided to apply the rest of the camouflage colours, moving on to the middle colour so that I could do any required touch-ups before doing the shading. This next colour would be a mix of 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 4 drops of Model Air 71109 PRU faded blue. However, this mix was still a bit too thin and spiderwebbed when I tried applying it onto the model, so I ended up adding 2 more drops of paint. I started applying it to the underside of the wings, painting the middle of each panel and then filling the surface in to create a subtle shading effect on the parts of the wings which would fold. I then very carefully painted along the edge where the white ended, keeping the paint mix and pressure low to achieve finer results, and then filling in each panel and building the colour up gradually. I had initially considered masking off this scheme, but I really wanted to have a faded and blended effect between these colours, and I feel like I achieved a really nice result by being very careful. Unfortunately, despite the new needle, I still encountered a lot of tip drying. I was reluctant though to add any retardant and risk the paint becoming too thin and flowing too much, so I decided to keep going and just try clearing the airbrush jams as they came as best I could. Next would be the third and darker upper surface colour, which I created using a mix of 4 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver with 4 drops of Model Air 71295 Flat USN Sea Blue. Once again, I mixed the paint and carefully applied it onto the middle of the panels and then filled it in gradually, in some spots keeping the paint very thin and patchy so that the white saturation would show through, giving it a faded appearance. Since I still had a bit of the sea blue in my airbrush, I added a drop of Insignia White and did some post shading, making the fabric and some random panels a bit lighter than others to achieve some discoloration. I did this effect heavier than I normally would, as looking at photos of Corsairs on Guadalcanal shows that they were very often weather beaten, and the US Navy colours from World War II often noticeably fade when the aircraft were left out in the harsh Pacific theatre weather. Insignia White mixed with a bit of flow improver was then sprayed onto the underside of the aircraft for some post shading, though I left the PRU blue as it was since some of the pre-shading was still showing through it, and this colour would be less exposed to the harsh sun unlike the dark upper side colours. The landing gear didn't seem to have received a very good coverage of the underside colour, so I ended up brush painting it with a few layers of Insignia White, and in between coats I painted the tips of the propeller blades with a base coat of model colour pink. 883 appeared to have a bit of respray under the numbers, so I used a fine brush to paint some roughly square patches of the flat USN Sea Blue, and also repainted some random panels, making it look like the aircraft had received a few new parts. Corsairs on Guadalcanal would occasionally receive newer parts off of other Corsairs that had been damaged in combat or were too unreliable to keep flying, which is, I believe, the fate that 883 would sadly eventually come to. The propeller tips were then given 2 coats of Vallejo Flat Yellow, which thanks to the pink base coat was very easy to apply, and after some final touch-ups of white on the landing gear, I carefully picked out the aircraft's tyres with some thinned down Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black using a fine brush. Since all of the airbrushing had been completed, I decided to remove the blue tack from the fuselage and engine, and then did some touch-ups using flat black and interior green around the cockpit area. After a final coat of the flat USN Sea Blue for the patchwork, I once again repaired the antenna and gave the whole model a coat of Vallejo gloss varnish, then down to roughly 1 part flow improver to 1 part varnish, applied in many light passes. The gloss varnish would protect the paint job and also provide a glossy surface to prevent the older decals from silvering. The varnish was given 12 hours to fully cure, and once that had passed, I then cut out 883's decals from the main sheet. As you can see, the decals had yellowed a fair bit, but I decided to still use them and let this play into this Corsair's rougher looking finish. The decals were sat in some hot water for a few seconds, and once they started to lift from the transfer paper, I slid them onto the model using my finger or a brush. Despite the yellowing, the decals went on very easily, with none of them getting damaged or even flaking. Once in place, they all received a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them stick to the model and sink into the surface details. Although decals were included for the walkways, I decided I wanted a rougher finish on them, so I roughly masked off the area where they'd be with some Tamiya masking tape, repaired the antenna which I'd broken again, and painted the walkway markings with a thick application of AK Interactive Dunkel Grau for a rough and faded black textured paint effect. I then did a coat of model colour flat black to darken them up a little bit, and to make them a bit more rough and damaged, I dabbed this paint on in a few spots, and then scratched some of it away gently using a needle and a cocktail stick. The results were pretty good in my opinion, though I could have probably been a bit neater with cleaning up the edges despite the masking. 2 coats of Vallejo matte varnish were then applied to seal in the decals, blend them in with the paint, and give the whole model a dull and more accurate matte finish for this scheme. Once applied, the matte varnish would be given a full 12 hours to fully cure before moving on to weathering. I usually start the weathering process first with some metal chipping, and for this I do an initial layer using some Vallejo Model Air aluminium. I dipped a fine brush in the paint, and then dabbed the brush onto some paper towel to remove most of the wet paint, and then dabbed the drier paint onto first the propeller spinner and the edges of the blade to create some chipping. I also swiped it across the propeller blades for a couple of larger scratches based on reference photos. I closely followed reference photos, applying the chipping onto the leading edges of the wing, and then quite heavily in a particular pattern along the panel lines near where the crew would stand on the wing to access the engine and fuel tanks, as well as around the foothole in the flaps, which would actually not have been present on an early Dash 1 model like A83, around the cowling and cow flaps, access hatches, and then very lightly on the main wheels, tail hook, landing gear doors, and underside of the cowling. I dab the paint on, taking care to apply it when it's dry and in very small amounts, building it up gradually in areas where I want a more chipped effect. This first layer acts as the deeper chips that have gone through the paint and primer, which you often see in more beaten up Corsairs. The next layer of chipping would be some of the primer colour, which you can also see subtly showing through in areas of heavy chipping in certain photos. For this I use a US primer colour from Vallejo, once again dry brushing and dabbing this colour very carefully on, mainly around the deeper scratches near the top of the wings, but also around the cockpit and various access hatches. The third and final layer of chipping would then be the more superficial scratches, which were created by mixing white with the camouflage colours and then dry brushing or swiping it onto the various panels around the walkway and engine cowling, where the aircraft paint could be scratched by the pilot or ground crew working on or getting into the aircraft. Once the chipping had dried, I then moved on to applying a coat of Tamiya black panel wash. This enamel wash was applied over all of the recessed panel lines to highlight them and also give the appearance of grime that's built up inside of the gaps. I made sure to apply this wash very heavily around the cowling area, since these areas could be very prominent on Corsairs given the amount of oil and grime they seem to spit out. I also tried using some brown enamel wash on the underside of the aircraft, which normally gives a more subtle effect on lighter colours and the appearance of dirt, but kind of ended up looking more like some sort of subtle rust wash, which I wasn't quite after. Once applied, the excess panel liner was then removed, and the effect softened by rubbing a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinner and rubbed over the entire model. I often try to rub in the direction air would flow over the aircraft to give the impression of streaks, and in some areas I rubbed away less of the effect, especially around the engine, to create the illusion of some built up oil and grime. To replicate the dried oil and grime you often see on the underside of Corsair's cowlings, I dabbed the cotton bud, leading to some very nice subtle splatter marks. I also used a brush dipped in the thinners to get into tight spaces such as the engine cowling and the landing gear. I also found the brush was very good at creating a subtle streaking effect down the fuselage by dipping the brush in thinners and then dragging it down the sides, causing some of the panel wash to streak downwards. Once I was finished doing the panel washes, I noticed that some of the paint and primer had peeled off, exposing the plastic on the leading and trailing edges of the wings. I've never had this happen before or since this build, but luckily the damage wasn't too serious, so I ended up using a brush to apply some of the gloss black primer in the spots the paint had gone, and while that primer cured, I painted the canopy frames a base coat of the interior green, which I'd used in the cockpit to replicate the internal frame structure. I also repaired the tail hook, pitot tube, and one of the landing gear bay doors which had come off during the panel wash. I left the model for a good day or so for the primer to cure, and then I was ready to paint over it, but before doing so I prepared some Abteilung oil paints by squeezing out ivory black, buff, engine grease, white and light mud onto some cardboard, and then I sat the cardboard aside for around about 2 hours so that any excess oil could leak out of the paints, ensuring they would have a matte finish. Within those 2 hours, I painted over the primer patch-ups with the relevant camouflage colours, doing my best to match them up with the base colours. A second coat of interior green was then applied onto the canopy, and I painted the exhausts with Vallejo Model Colour Gold as a base coat. By the time the acrylic paints had dried, which was not very long at all, the oil paints were ready to go. I reactivated them with some AK Interactive odorless thinners, and first started dabbing some blackened engine grease onto the edges of the fuel access hatch, as well as around the edges of the cowling and directly onto the exhausts using a fine brush. The ivory black was then dabbed and streaked backwards from the exhausts, as well as onto the ejection ports for the shells. The early model Corsairs seemed to be a bit notorious for having fuel and oil leaks, and even received modifications such as having their top cow flaps shut so that oil couldn't leak onto the cockpit window, and also often having the panels around the fuel tank and access hatch covered over with some sort of tape, but 883 didn't appear to have any of that. Looking at one particularly famous photo of Pappy in the cockpit, you can even see what appears to be some of these streaks of fuel leaking out. This was a bit of a tricky effect to try and replicate, but I found by using thinners to streak the blackened engine grime down the sides of the fuselage and onto the wings, and then applying some more oil paint and once again thinning it down in a few spots, I was able to gradually build it up and achieve the effect that you can see in various photos. More dabbing and streaking was then done to the underside exhaust smoke, and some black oil paint was then dabbed over the machine guns for some gun smoke. From my knowledge, most of the airstrip of Guadalcanal was covered in crushed coral to prevent aircraft from sinking into the mud, so I decided to apply a fair bit of buff and white oil paints onto the tyres, and then gradually remove the excess with the thinners to create a thick build-up of what looks like coral dust on the treads. More of the buff and also some light mud was then dabbed over the wings and walkway area to replicate dried coral and sand getting traipsed over the wings and getting stained there by the ground crew. As well as looking at photos of the beaten up Guadalcanal Corsairs, I also found some rather interesting photos of a pristine restored Corsair that was flying, which if you look very closely at the cow flaps showed signs of fresh oil leaks. This illustrates that even on a well-kept Corsair that wasn't in combat and being used heavily, you would encounter some sort of oil stain and leaking. I decided to try and replicate some fresh and old stains on this war-weary Corsair by first applying some X20 enamel thinners onto the cowling, and then using a very fine brush, I dragged some light streaks of XF1 flat black onto these areas. This was then blended a bit using some thinners to create the dried oil, and then I applied some more fine streaks, this time with X1 gloss black for the fresh oil leaks. I then set the model aside to allow the oil and enamel paints time to dry, and in the meantime hand painted the canopy with its exterior colour of USNC blue mixed with a bit of white. I applied 2 coats of this exterior colour, and since I'd used acrylic paints, I could then carefully scratch away any mistakes I'd made using a cocktail stick until I'd achieved a nice thin and clean looking result for all of the canopy frames. The kit's canopy lacks the early -1A's extra frames, but decals are included to replicate them, which were applied and seemed to work okay even with a bit of silvering. The final details on the aircraft to paint were now the nav and identification lights, which I created first by painting the recessed nav lights with some Model Air RLM01 silver, and then dabbed a small dollop of this paint where the ID lights would be on the underside of the right wing. While the silver base colours for these lights dried, I replaced the tail antenna with a bit of painted sprue, and once this was in place, I then added the rigging wire by using some AK Interactive mega thin rigging wire glued to the two antennas with Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. Once the main wire was in place, I then carefully added the smaller wire, which leads to just behind the cockpit and then back to the tail antenna. There seems to be quite a few different configurations used by Dash 1 Corsairs for rigging, but I decided to go with this particular setup based on artwork I'd seen of 883, and it seeming to vaguely match up with what I can see in photos. By now the silver base colour had dried, so I painted the nav lights with Tamiya clear red and green, and for the ID lights I used clear red and green as well, with some model colour yellow since I didn't have any clear yellow for the third light. And finally, after a dab of gloss varnish onto the ID lights to give them a bit of shine, my out-of-the-box build of the Hasegawa 1/72nd scale F4U-1A Corsair was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So I had a lot of fun with this build. It was easy to put together and definitely a nice palette cleanser in between more complex kits and 3D printing. It was also a really nice chance to revisit a classic since I built the Dash 1D Hasegawa kit when I was about 15, so it's very nice to see the difference after a few years of model making. While you could build this kit with its included raised panel lines, I really wanted to practice rescoring on a smaller and cheaper kit such as this one, and I think that the massive access hatch on the forward fuselage is a really noticeable feature on the Corsair, which is a bit of a shame that this kit misses out on it. For the first time, I feel like my recess panels really improved the kit, though next time I'll maybe try and fill them in with a bit of Vallejo water-based putty just to make them a little bit more subtle. I'm really happy with the paint job, and if it weren't for the tip drying, painting the faded three-tone scheme would have been pure fun, and it was super satisfying to see the effect of these layers build up and blend them together. It was a really fun challenge to try and achieve a heavier and Corsair specific effect with the weathering, and I feel like looking at reference photos very closely while doing the metal chipping helped me achieve a much more subtle and realistic effect, which is more heavy in areas where it's appropriate. The Hasegawa Corsair may be old and basic, but it's really simple, goes together well, provided you do a bit of sanding, looks pretty accurate on the outside, and better yet, in Australia, it retails in some places for as low as 15 AUD, so you're getting a very good price for a model of this size and vintage. The Hasegawa kit definitely still has its place as a cheap, simple build for beginners, or a nice basic kit to practice new tricks on without much risk to your bank account. So it's definitely one I would recommend for almost anyone, and I'm very much looking forward to building the second kit in this combo set, and seeing how far I can push this venerable kit with a few modifications and a bit of 3D printing. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as that really helps things out. And if you want to help me fund my builds and projects, please be sure to check out my Patreon, the link to which I'll leave in the description. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons who helped to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them, and the time I spend making these videos. So without you guys, this wouldn't be possible. Part 3 of my Revell Corsair build will finally be coming out after a lot of delays due to working out the 3D printing for the figures. And of course I'll be doing a build of the second Corsair in this kit, which I have not yet started, and for that one I'll be doing a lot of upgrades, as I previously mentioned. I'll be doing a 3,000 subscriber Q&A special very soon, so if you have any questions, be sure to pop them down in the comments of this video. Otherwise though, that's it for now, but until the next one, as always, take care and model on.